A tennis court, not at Wimbledon, not at Roland Garros, but 5,000 feet up in the hills of northeastern India. On one baseline, Japanese soldiers dig in behind machine gun nests. On the other baseline, 70 yards away, British and Indian troops huddle in their own trenches. Between them, the tennis court has become a no man's land, where grenades arc through the humid air like deadly shuttlecocks, and men fight hand to hand among the shattered remains of what was once a genteel colonial sports ground. The distance between the two sides? So close that you could literally have a conversation with the enemy. So close that when someone threw a grenade, you had exactly 14 seconds from the moment you heard the plop of it, leaving the launcher until it exploded in your trench. This was Kohima in April and May of 1944. And this tennis court, this absurdly small piece of real estate, became the focal point of one of the most savage battles of the entire Second World War. A battle that would determine whether Japan could invade India. A battle that historians would come to call the Stalingrad of the East. A battle that, despite its immense strategic importance and the horrific intensity of the fighting, remains relatively unknown in the broader narrative of World War II. Today, if you visit Kohima, the capital of the Indian state of Nagaland, you'll find that tennis court again. It's been carefully marked out on the grounds of the Kohima War Cemetery, which stands where the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow once overlooked the vital road from Dimapur to Imphal. The cemetery holds the graves of 1,420 Commonwealth soldiers who died in the battle, their white headstones arranged on terraces that climb the hillside. At the entrance, you'll see words carved in stone, an epitaph that has become one of the most famous from any war. When you go home, tell them of us and say, "For your tomorrow, we gave our today." But before we talk about the end, we need to understand the beginning. We need to understand how a small administrative hill station in the remote corner of northeastern India became the site of what Field Marshal William Slim would call one of the greatest battles in history. We need to understand the desperate gamble that brought 15,000 Japanese soldiers over the mountains from Burma. We need to understand the handful of defenders who held them off against impossible odds. And we need to understand why, when the British National Army Museum asked the public to vote for Britain's greatest battle, it wasn't Waterloo or Trafalgar or even D-Day that took the top spot. It was Kohima, fought alongside its sister battle at Imphal. The story of Kohima is one of command decisions and strategic importance, yes, but it's also deeply, intensely human. It's about men reduced to their most basic instincts for survival, fighting in conditions that would break most people within days, yet somehow finding the strength to hold on for weeks. It's about a Victoria Cross winner who single-handedly charged a Japanese machine gun nest, threw a grenade inside, and then came back carrying the enemy weapon as a trophy before going out the next morning to do it again. It's about a tennis court where the dead couldn't be buried because they lay in no man's land, and the living couldn't move during daylight because snipers covered every inch of ground. It's about soldiers on both sides pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, fighting not just each other, but also disease, starvation, and a landscape that seemed designed to kill them. It's about the indigenous Naga people, caught in a war not of their making, who nevertheless provided invaluable support to the Allied forces as guides, porters, stretcher-bearers, and combatants. Without them, the battle might have ended very differently. But most of all, Kohima is about a turning point. Before Kohima, the Japanese army seemed unstoppable in Asia. After Kohima, they were broken. The Battle of Kohima, fought in tandem with the Battle of Imphal, marked the beginning of the end for Japanese ambitions in Southeast Asia. It was the largest defeat the Imperial Japanese Army had ever suffered, and it opened the door for the reconquest of Burma and the eventual Allied victory in the East. The comparison to Stalingrad isn't made lightly. Like Stalingrad, Kohima was an urban battle fought building by building, trench by trench. Like Stalingrad, it represented the high water mark of an invasion that promised to change the course of the war. Like Stalingrad, the defenders were vastly outnumbered and surrounded, yet they held. And like Stalingrad, the battle's outcome sent shockwaves through the highest levels of command on both sides, fundamentally altering the strategic calculus of the entire theatre. But while Stalingrad has entered popular consciousness through countless films, books, and documentaries, Kohima remains in the shadows. The men who fought there called themselves the Forgotten Army, and in many ways, they still are. This is the story they deserve to have told. This is the story of how a few thousand defenders on a ridge in Nagaland stopped an empire in its tracks. This is the story of Kohima. To understand what happened at Kohima, we need to roll the clock back to early 1944 and understand the strategic situation that made this remote hill station worth fighting for. The story begins not in India but in Burma, which had fallen to the Japanese in the spring of 1942 in one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. The conquest of Burma had been swift and brutal. In just 5 months, the Japanese had driven British, Indian, and Burmese forces on the longest retreat in British military history. A 900-mile fighting withdrawal through jungle, across rivers, and over mountains that cost tens of thousands of lives. By May 1942, the rising sun flag flew over Rangoon and Japan controlled all of Burma, cutting the overland supply route to China and bringing Japanese forces right up to the border of British India itself. For 2 years, the front lines had remained relatively static along the mountainous Burma-India border. But the Japanese were far from idle. They were watching, they were planning. And by the end of 1943, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, commander of the Japanese 15th Army, had convinced his superiors to approve one of the most ambitious operations of the Pacific War, Operation U-Go. Mutaguchi was a man with something to prove. A veteran of campaigns in China and Malaya, he had earned a reputation as an aggressive, some would say reckless, commander. He was stubborn, prone to quarreling with his subordinates, and possessed of an ego that wouldn't allow him to admit when he was wrong. He had been present at the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, the spark that ignited the full-scale Japanese invasion of China, and he carried that aggressive spirit with him wherever he went. Now, looking at the British positions in northeastern India, Mutaguchi saw an opportunity not just for a tactical victory, but for something far grander, the invasion of India itself. The official objectives of Operation U-Go were more modest. The plan called for Japanese forces to capture the British supply bases around Imphal, a town located on a plain in the state of Manipur, and to cut the road linking Imphal to the railhead at Dimapur. This would disrupt Allied plans for an offensive into Burma and, critically, would interrupt the air supply route to China, where American forces were trying to keep Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces in the war against Japan. Securing Imphal would also give the Japanese a forward base from which to launch air attacks deeper into India. But Mutaguchi's ambitions went far beyond these limited goals. He believed that a successful invasion of northeastern India would trigger a popular uprising against British rule. He had at his disposal the Indian National Army, formed from Indian prisoners of war and led by nationalist leader Subhas Chandra Bose, and he was convinced that their presence would inspire the Indian population to rise up and overthrow their colonial masters. In Mutaguchi's vision, Operation U-Go would spark a revolution that would topple the British Raj and hand India to Japan's greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. He even spoke grandly of a march on Delhi. His superiors were more skeptical. Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe, commander of Burma Area Army, had serious reservations about the operation's logistics. The terrain between Burma and India was some of the most hostile on Earth, mountains covered in dense jungle,
rivers that swelled to torrents during the monsoon season, and almost no roads worthy of the name. Supplying an entire army across this landscape would be
extraordinarily difficult. Despite these concerns, the operation was approved in January 1944. Part of the reason was the influence of Army Minister Hideki Tojo, who overruled objections from field commanders. Part of it was the Japanese High Command's persistent underestimation of British and Indian fighting ability based on the easy victories of 1942. And part of it was simple opportunity. If Japan didn't act now, the British would. The plan assigned 3 divisions of the 15th Army to different objectives. The 33rd Division would attack Imphal from the south, cutting off the 17th Indian Division. The 15th Division would strike from the east and northeast, severing the road to Kohima. And crucially for our story, the 31st Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, would march to Kohima itself, cut the road to Dimapur, and prevent British reinforcements from reaching the besieged forces at Imphal. Once Kohima fell, Mutaguchi planned to send Sato's division onto Dimapur, where the Japanese would seize the vital railhead and supply dumps. The capture of Dimapur would effectively cut off the entire British 14th Army, leaving them stranded and vulnerable. From there, the invasion of India could begin in earnest. It was an audacious plan. It was also deeply flawed. The first problem was logistics. Mutaguchi's planners had calculated that the operation needed to be completed within 3 weeks, before the onset of the monsoon in May would make operations virtually impossible. The Japanese supply line would stretch over 200 kilometers across some of the worst terrain in the world, with almost no roads and only mountain tracks for the soldiers to follow. Rather than establish proper supply lines, Mutaguchi's plan relied heavily on capturing British supply dumps. If that didn't happen, his soldiers would starve. To supplement their meager supplies, the Japanese brought along thousands of oxen, cattle, and even elephants to carry equipment and serve as emergency rations. But getting these animals across the mountains proved even harder than moving men. Of the 5,000 cattle that started the march, only 1,000 reached Sato's headquarters. The rest died along the way, slipped off mountain paths, or were simply abandoned when they could go no further. This was not a supply chain. This was a logistical catastrophe waiting to happen. The second problem was timing. Mutaguchi's plan depended on speed and surprise. The Japanese needed to strike before the British could properly reinforce their positions, and they needed to capture objectives quickly enough that the monsoon didn't trap them in India with no supplies and no way home. As we'll see, this timetable was unrealistic from the start, and delays would prove fatal. The third problem, though no one knew it yet, was that the British were no longer the demoralized, poorly led force that had fled Burma in 1942. Under the command of Lieutenant General William Slim, the British 14th Army had been rebuilt, retrained, and reinvigorated. Slim was a commander of rare ability, a man who understood both the strategic big picture and the needs of the individual soldier in the foxhole. He had learned from the defeats of 42 and had transformed his army into a force capable of meeting the Japanese on their own terms in the jungle. Slim had correctly anticipated that the Japanese would attack in early 1944, though he initially underestimated the scale of the offensive. His plan was to allow the Japanese to advance into India, where they would be fighting at the end of long and vulnerable supply lines, while British forces would be supported by superior logistics and, crucially, total air supremacy. In the plain at Imphal, Slim concentrated his forces, stockpiled supplies, and prepared to receive the Japanese attack. He was confident that with proper preparation, he could not just stop the Japanese but destroy them. But there was one problem: Kohima. The little hill station hadn't figured prominently in Slim's initial calculations. He had focused his attention and resources on defending Imphal, believing that Kohima, if attacked at all, would face only a diversionary force. He was wrong. Kohima sits at 5,200 feet above sea level in the Naga Hills, straddling a ridge that runs roughly north to south. Through the town ran the only viable road connecting the railhead at Dimapur with the British positions at Imphal, 80 miles to the south. This road was not just important, it was absolutely vital. Without it, the British forces at Imphal couldn't be supplied or reinforced. If the Japanese cut this road and held it, Imphal would fall. And if Imphal fell, the entire Allied position in northeastern India would collapse. The town itself was small, an administrative centre for the Naga Hills district with a population of a few thousand. It had the usual trappings of a British hill station, the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow with its terraced gardens and tennis court, a jail, hospitals, supply depots, and various administrative buildings. The ridge on which Kohima sat was about a mile long and 400 yards wide at its widest point, with a series of hills and gullies running alongside the road. To the north lay Naga village, home to the indigenous Naga people, crowned by features the British would name Treasury Hill and Church Knoll. To the south and west were GPT Ridge, named for the General Purpose Transport Depot, and the jungle-covered Aradura Spur. The terrain was nightmarish for defenders. The ridge was too long to be held by a small force, yet not wide enough to provide much depth of defense. The slopes were densely forested, providing cover for attackers. Many positions on the ridge were overlooked by higher ground, meaning that Japanese observers could call down fire on anyone who moved, and the town was built on a series of terraces and hillocks, each of which would have to be fought for separately. It was, in short, a defender's nightmare and an attacker's opportunity, assuming the attacker had enough men and was willing to pay the price in blood. By late March 1944, as Mutaguchi's forces began their advance, Kohima was garrisoned by a mixed bag of units. The newly raised 1st Battalion of the Assam Regiment, a few platoons of the paramilitary Assam Rifles, and various rear echelon troops who had been stationed there for administrative duties. These were not frontline combat troops. They were clerks, drivers, medical personnel, and garrison soldiers who had expected to sit out the war in a quiet hill station far from the fighting. That was about to change dramatically. Lieutenant General Montague Stopford, commander of Yixit Corps, began sending reinforcements to Kohima in late March, but his movements were hesitant and confused. The 161st Indian Brigade was initially deployed to Kohima, then ordered back to Dimapur, then sent forward again. This dithering cost precious time. When the Japanese arrived on the outskirts of Kohima on April 4th, only one battalion of the 161st Brigade had made it into the town. The 4th Battalion, Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment. 446 men under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Laverty. They arrived on the same day the Japanese did, literally marching into town as the enemy was approaching from the east. To command this hastily assembled garrison, the British appointed Colonel Hugh Richards, a former Chindit who had experience in long-range penetration operations behind Japanese lines. Richards took command on March 22nd and found himself responsible for defending Kohima with whatever forces he could scrape together. By the time the Japanese attacked, he had approximately 2,500 men under his command, but only about 1,500 of them were trained combat troops. The rest were the non-combatants, the administrative personnel, who had suddenly found themselves in the front line of what would become one of the most savage battles of the war. Richards and his men had less than 2 weeks to prepare. They dug trenches, laid barbed wire where they could get it, positioned their limited artillery, and tried to create some semblance of a defensive perimeter. But there simply wasn't enough time, and there weren't enough men. The perimeter they established stretched across the ridge, anchored on several key features: Garrison Hill, where Richards placed his headquarters; Dis Hill, named for the detail issue store; FSD Hill, for the field supply depot; Jail Hill, where the town prison stood; Kuki Piquet, a small hillock; and the area around the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow and its famous tennis court. Facing them was the entire Japanese 31st Division, 15,000 men battle-hardened from campaigns across Asia. The division consisted of the 58th, 124th, and 138th Infantry Regiments, supported by the 31st Mountain Artillery Regiment. Leading them was Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, a man who would become one of the most controversial figures in Japanese military history. The stage was set. In the first week of April 1944, two armies were converging on a small hill stationed in northeastern India. One was confident in its numerical superiority and convinced of its inevitable victory. The other was outnumbered 6-1 and fighting for its life. Between them lay a tennis court that would become one of the most famous battlefields of World War II. The Japanese plan was simple: overwhelm Kohima quickly, capture the vital road junction, then press on to Dimapur while the rest of the 15th Army destroyed the British at Imphal. What actually happened would be very different, because the men defending Kohima, British and Indian soldiers alike, had no intention of giving up their ridge without a fight. And the Naga people, whose land had become a battlefield, would play a role that no one had anticipated. The battle was about to begin, and it would rage for 64 days of unimaginable brutality. This was Kohima's moment, and the world was about to learn why small places can matter in big ways. Every great battle is shaped not just by strategy and tactics, but by the personalities of the men who command. At Kohima, 3 generals stood at the center of events, each bringing their own strengths, weaknesses, and demons to the fight. Understanding them helps us understand why the battle unfolded as it did. Let's start with Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, the man who would lead the Japanese assault on Kohima. Sato was born on March 5, 1893, in Yamagata Prefecture in northern Japan. He was a career soldier who had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1913 and the Army Staff College in 1921. His military record was solid, if unremarkable. He had commanded the 75th Infantry Regiment at the Battle of Lake Khasan in 1938, where his men had suffered over 50% casualties but refused to budge from their positions before launching a night assault that drove out Soviet forces. The Japanese military establishment considered it a model tactical operation, and Sato had boasted afterward that he looked forward to being given the worst position again in future battles. By 1943, Sato had risen to command the 31st Division. He was a hard-bitten combat veteran, respected by his men for his personal courage and his willingness to share their hardships. But he was also a realist, sometimes brutally so, and he had a reputation for speaking his mind regardless of the consequences. This quality would serve him well with his troops, but would make him powerful enemies among his superiors. Chief among those enemies was Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, commander of the Japanese 15th Army and the architect of Operation Yugo. If Sato was a realist, Mutaguchi was a dreamer, and not in a good way. He was stubborn to the point of irrationality, convinced of his own brilliance, and utterly unwilling to admit when he was wrong. He quarreled constantly with his subordinate commanders, treating their concerns with contempt. To make matters worse, Mutaguchi and Sato had a personal animosity that stretched back more than a decade. In the early 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Army had been racked by factional infighting between two groups, the Toseiha, or Control Faction, and the Kodoha, or Imperial Way Faction. Sato had aligned with the Toseiha, while Mutaguchi had been part of the Kodoha. During this period, Sato discovered that his movements were being monitored and reported to Mutaguchi, who was then part of the General Affairs Bureau. Sato believed, probably correctly, that Mutaguchi was spying on him and trying to undermine him. He never forgave the slight, and by the time Operation Yugo was launched, The two men could barely stand to be in the same room. Sato considered Mutaguchi a blockhead, and he made no secret of it. When he was assigned to lead the assault on Kohima, he was appalled by what he saw as the plan's glaring flaws. He had not been involved in the planning of Operation Yugo, and he immediately recognized that the logistics were a disaster waiting to happen. He told his officers bluntly that they should prepare to starve to death in the mountains because Mutaguchi had made no realistic provision for supply or resupply. He predicted correctly that the operation would fail. But Sato was a soldier, and when ordered to attack, he would attack. He would do his duty, even if he believed the man giving the orders was leading them all to destruction. This tension between duty and judgment would define Sato's role in the Battle of Kohima, and it would ultimately make him one of the most controversial figures in Japanese military history. Mutaguchi, meanwhile, was in his element. He saw Operation Yugo not as a desperate gamble, but as his chance for glory. He genuinely believed that capturing Imphal and Kohima would trigger a revolution in India that would drive out the British. He spoke grandly of the march on Delhi, even though his actual orders from Burma Area Army limited his objectives to Imphal and the surrounding region. He brushed aside concerns about logistics, confident that his troops would capture enough British supplies to sustain themselves. When subordinates raised objections, he dismissed them as cowards or fools. This wasn't just hubris, it was a fundamental disconnect from reality. Mutaguchi seemed genuinely unable to understand that determination alone couldn't overcome the laws of physics and logistics. You couldn't will supplies into existence. You couldn't march an army 200 kilometers over mountain tracks without establishing secure supply lines. You couldn't win a battle just because you wanted to badly enough. But Mutaguchi believed you could, and he would drive his army to destruction, trying to prove it. Facing both Sato and Mutaguchi across the battle lines was Lieutenant General William Slim, and if Mutaguchi represented the worst qualities of military command, Slim represented very nearly the best. William Joseph Slim was born in Bristol, England, on August the 6th, 1891, to a modest family. He didn't come from wealth or privilege. His father was a hardware merchant, and young Bill had to work his way up through sheer ability and determination. When World War I broke out, he received a temporary commission in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment and saw action at Gallipoli, where he was wounded, and in Mesopotamia, where he earned a military cross. After the war, rather than return to civilian life, Slim secured a permanent commission in the Indian Army. His interwar career was slow, as careers often were in peacetime, but he attended the Staff College at Quetta and later taught at the Staff College in Camberley. He was a thoughtful officer, always studying, always learning. He even wrote novels and short stories under the pen name Anthony Mills to supplement his income. When World War II began, Slim was commanding a battalion of Gurkhas. He rose rapidly through the ranks, seeing action in East Africa, Eritrea, Syria, and Iraq before being posted to Burma in 1942. There, as commander of Burma Corps, he oversaw the 900-mile fighting retreat to India that everyone called a defeat, but which Slim had managed to prevent from becoming a complete rout. It was a masterpiece of controlled withdrawal, saving tens of thousands of lives that would have been lost in a panicked flight. After the disaster in Burma, Slim could have been sidelined, blamed for a defeat that wasn't really his fault. Instead, he was promoted. In October 1943, he took command of the newly formed 14th Army, a massive multinational force that would eventually grow to nearly 1 million men. It was composed primarily of British and Indian troops, but also included significant contingents from Africa, Nepal, and elsewhere across the British Empire and Commonwealth. It was, in short, a polyglot army, speaking dozens of languages, practicing multiple religions, and coming from vastly different cultures. Slim's genius was in welding this diverse force into a cohesive, effective fighting machine. He did it through a combination of practical reforms, personal charisma, and genuine care for his soldiers' welfare. Unlike many generals who commanded from comfortable headquarters far from the front, Slim made a point of visiting forward positions regularly. He talked to his men, listened to their concerns, and made sure they knew that he understood what they were going through. They called him Uncle Bill, a nickname that reflected both affection and respect. Slim understood that morale was as important as firepower. He knew that the defeats of 1942 had shaken his troops' confidence, and he set about rebuilding it. He emphasized training, particularly jungle warfare training. The Japanese had beaten the British in the jungle in 42, but Slim was determined that wouldn't happen again. He taught his men how to fight in the dense undergrowth, how to navigate by compass when the sun was invisible through the canopy, how to survive on reduced rations, and most importantly, how to overcome the psychological advantage the Japanese had gained through their earlier victories. He also recognized that the jungle itself was as much an enemy as the Japanese. Malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases were putting more men in hospital than enemy bullets. Slim made disease control a priority, enforcing strict discipline about taking anti-malarial medication. He improved rations, knowing that well-fed soldiers fought better. He made sure that medical care was available close to the front lines. He even addressed mental health, recognizing that the stress of jungle warfare could break men who would have been fine in a conventional battle. But Slim was also a brilliant tactician. He developed the concept of the defensive box, strong points that could be supplied by air even when surrounded by enemy forces. This was revolutionary. In the early days of the war, being cut off by the Japanese meant probable destruction. By 1944, thanks to Allied air superiority and Slim's new tactics, being surrounded meant you could hold out indefinitely while reinforcements fought their way to you. This would prove crucial at both Imphal and Kohima. Slim was a careful planner, but he was also willing to take calculated risks. When the Japanese launched Operation Yugo, he made a decision that shocked many of his subordinates. Rather than try to stop the Japanese at the border, he would allow them to advance into India, where they would be fighting at the end of increasingly tenuous supply lines, while his own forces would be well supplied and supported by total air superiority. It was a calculated gamble, allowing the enemy to penetrate deep into British-held territory. But Slim was confident it would work. He was betting that he could destroy the Japanese 15th Army not by stopping them at the gates, but by letting them exhaust themselves against prepared defenses. There was just one problem with this plan. Slim initially underestimated the Japanese threat to Kohima. He had focused most of his attention and resources on Imphal, believing that Kohima would face only a relatively small diversionary force. When he finally realized that an entire Japanese division was heading for the Little Hill station, he had to scramble to reinforce it. The 2nd British Division was rushed across India by rail to meet the threat, but it would be a race against time. So we have our 3 principals: Sato, the realist, who believed the operation was doomed, but would do his duty anyway; Mutaguchi, the fantasist who believed willpower could overcome logistics; and Slim, the careful professional who had transformed a defeated army into a winning one, but who had nearly missed the threat to Kohima. Their decisions, their personalities, and their interactions would shape everything that followed. But there's one more character in this drama who deserves mention: Colonel Hugh Richards, the garrison commander at Kohima. Richards had served with the Chindits, the legendary long-range penetration units that operated behind Japanese lines in Burma. He was experienced in the kind of desperate, isolated fighting that the Chindits specialized in. When he arrived at Kohima in late March to take command of the garrison, he found a situation that would have daunted most men: a strategically vital position with inadequate forces, insufficient time to prepare proper defenses, and an enemy of unknown but certainly superior strength about to arrive at any moment. Richards was a quiet, competent officer, not given to heroics or grand gestures. He simply set about doing what needed to be done. He organized his hodgepodge of units into a coherent defense. He positioned his limited artillery where it would do the most good. He tried, with limited success, to impose some order on the chaos of a garrison that had grown haphazardly and consisted of units that had never trained together. He dealt with personality clashes among his officers, including a particularly difficult relationship with the commander of the Royal West Kents, who resented taking orders from Richards and made no secret of it. Richards knew he was vastly outnumbered. He knew his defenses were inadequate. He knew that if the Japanese attacked with their full strength, his garrison couldn't hold indefinitely. But he also knew that every day he could hold Kohima was another day for reinforcements to arrive, another day for Slim's grand strategy to work. So he prepared to fight, and he prepared his men to hold to the last. These were the men who would shape the Battle of Kohima. On one side, the Japanese combination of Mutaguchi's ambition and Sato's reluctant professionalism. On the other, Slim's strategic vision and Richards's tactical determination. In the middle, thousands of ordinary soldiers who would be asked to do extraordinary things. The clash of these personalities, these strategies, these very different military cultures would turn a small ridge in the Naga Hills into one of the most important battlefields of World War II. And it would begin in just days. To understand the Battle of Kohima, you need to understand the ground on which it was fought. Terrain shapes battles, sometimes more than weapons or numbers or tactics. At Kohima, the terrain was unique, nightmarish, and absolutely crucial to everything that would follow. Imagine you're standing on Garrison Hill, the highest point of the Kohima Ridge, looking out over the battlefield. You're at an elevation of roughly 5,200 feet above sea level. The air is thinner here, and even in April, before the monsoon, the mornings can be cool and misty. Below you stretches Kohima Ridge, running roughly north-south for about a mile, narrow, barely 400 yards wide at its widest point. The ridge is not a smooth feature. It's a series of hillocks, gullies, and terraces, each with its own name that will become familiar to the men fighting here. Starting from the north, you have Jail Hill, where the local prison sits, its high walls providing some cover. Moving south along the ridge, you come to Deer's Hill, named for the detail issue store where supplies were distributed. Then there's FSD Hill, the Field Supply Depot, another supply point. These hills are connected by saddles and ridges, some barely wide enough for the road that winds through them. At the center of the position is Garrison Hill itself, where Colonel Richards has established his headquarters. It's the key to the entire defensive position, a feature that dominates the surrounding area. Before the war, the locals called it Summerhouse Hill, after a pleasant structure that once stood there. That summer house is long gone now, destroyed by the first rounds of Japanese artillery. Below Garrison Hill, the ground falls away in a series of terraces to the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow. This had been the residence of Charles Pawsey, the British administrator for the Naga Hills district. Pawsey had evacuated before the battle began, but his bungalow and the terraced gardens around it would become the focal point of the fiercest fighting. The terraces were originally designed for flower beds and vegetable gardens, pleasant enough in peacetime. In war, they became natural defensive positions, each level offering cover and commanding fire over the levels below. On one of these terraces, about 40 feet above the bungalow itself, was the tennis court. It was an asphalt surface, regulation size, with a clubhouse nearby where the Deputy Commissioner and his friends had once gathered for drinks after their games. That tennis court would become famous. The Japanese would occupy one baseline, the British the other, with the court itself as no man's land. Hand-to-hand fighting would rage across that small rectangle of asphalt. Grenades would arc back and forth like tennis balls. Men would die within yards of where they had killed their enemies. Below the DC's bungalow was the traffic control point, where the road from Dimapur made a sharp turn toward Imphal. This was the strategic center of everything. Control this junction, and you controlled the only viable road between the British railhead and their forces at Imphal. Lose it, and Imphal would be cut off. To the north of the main ridge lay Naga village, a densely populated area where the indigenous Naga people lived. The village was dominated by two features: Treasury Hill, where the district treasury was located, and Church Knoll, crowned by a Baptist church. The Naga had been Christianized by missionaries over the previous half-century, and these churches were central to their communities. The hills around Naga village were steep and heavily forested, perfect for infiltration and ambush. To the south and west of the main ridge were GPT Ridge, named for the General Purpose Transport Depot, and the jungle-covered Aradura Spur. These features commanded the southern approaches to Kohima and would see bitter fighting in the later stages of the battle. The vegetation made everything worse. The slopes of the ridges were densely forested with jungle growth. You couldn't see more than a few yards in any direction. The trees provided concealment for attackers and made it nearly impossible to maintain visual contact between friendly positions. The undergrowth was so thick that in places you had to hack your way through with machetes, and the roots and vines turned every movement into a struggle, especially at night. The ground itself was treacherous. The soil was thin over bedrock in many places, which made digging proper trenches difficult. Where the soil was deeper, heavy rains quickly turned it into clinging mud that made every step an effort. The steep slopes meant that digging in required tremendous effort. You couldn't just scrape a foxhole in flat ground. You had to excavate into the hillside or build up protective walls of sandbags and logs. Every position had to be terraced, and every terrace required hours of back-breaking labor. Water was a critical problem. There were no streams or springs on the ridge itself. Water had to be brought up from wells in the valley below, which meant water parties had to descend through the Japanese positions at night, fill their containers, and haul them back up the hill. Miss a night's water run, and the next day you would fight with a parched throat and growing desperation. Some positions went for days without adequate water. The defenders had tried to create a coherent defensive perimeter, but the terrain made it almost impossible. There was simply too much ground to cover with too few men. Richards had about 1,500 combat troops to defend a perimeter that stretched for over a mile through broken, jungled terrain. That meant thin lines, gaps between positions, and constant worry about infiltration. The Japanese were masters of infiltration tactics, moving silently through the jungle at night to appear suddenly in the rear of defensive positions. At Kohima, the terrain gave them every advantage. The artillery positions were problematic too. The British had brought in howitzers, but there were no good positions for them on the ridge itself. They had to be emplaced back at Jotsoma, about 2 miles to the west, where the 161st Brigade's artillery had set up. Firing from Jotsoma meant that every artillery mission required careful coordination, and the shells had to arc over the British positions to hit Japanese targets just dozens of yards away. There would be no room for error. An artillery round falling short could slaughter an entire British platoon. And then there was the problem of fields of fire. In European warfare, defenders wanted clear fields of fire so they could see attackers coming from hundreds of yards away and cut them down with machine guns. At Kohima, the jungle grew right up to the defensive positions in many places. You couldn't see the enemy until they were practically on top of you. This negated many of the advantages of defensive warfare and played right into Japanese tactics, which emphasized close combat and infiltration. The garrison itself was a mixed bag of units, thrown together with little time to train as a cohesive force. At its core was the 4th Battalion, Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment, the Dirty Half Hundred, 446 men under Lieutenant Colonel John Laverty. The West Kents were a solid professional unit, but they had never fought together with the other elements of the garrison. There was a company from the 4th Battalion, 7th Rajput Regiment, Indian troops who would prove their worth in the fighting to come. There was the battered remnant of the 1st Battalion, Assam Regiment, men who had already fought delaying actions at Jesami and Karasom and had marched into Kohima exhausted, some without boots, many wounded, all desperately short of sleep.
These men had seen what the Japanese could do, and they were under no illusions about what was coming. They were units of the Assam Rifles, a paramilitary force recruited from local tribes and used primarily for internal security. They had some training, but had never expected to fight a pitched battle against a Japanese division. There was the Sher Regiment, a battalion of Nepalese troops that was only partially trained and barely combat-ready. And then there were all the odds and sods, the non-combatants who suddenly found themselves in a frontline position. Clerks from the administrative offices, drivers from the motor pool, medics, cooks, quartermaster personnel, anyone who could hold a rifle. In total, Richards had about 2,500 men, but only 1,500 of them were trained combat troops. The rest were doing their best, but their best wasn't always good enough. Many of these non-combatants had never been in a firefight before. The sound of incoming artillery, the scream of Japanese infantry attacking at night, the sight of men being blown apart by mortar fire, all of it was new and terrifying. Richards did what he could to organize this disparate collection into something resembling a defense. He positioned the West Kents on the key features, Garrison Hill, Dis Hill, and the area around the DC's bungalow. The Rajputs held positions on the southern end of the perimeter. The Assam units covered the Ard. Approaches from Naga village. The Sher Regiment was held in reserve, such as it was. Everyone else filled in the gaps. Supplies were another nightmare. The garrison had stockpiled ammunition and rations in the various depots scattered across the ridge, but no one had expected a prolonged siege. There was food for a few weeks if rationed carefully, ammunition for perhaps the same, and medical supplies that would prove woefully inadequate once the casualties started mounting. There was no barbed wire to speak of, precious little sandbags, and not nearly enough entrenching tools to properly fortify the perimeter. The defenders did have some advantages. The ridge was high ground, which is almost always preferable to low ground in warfare. They had artillery support from Jotsoma, although it would be dangerous to call in fire so close to friendly positions. Most importantly, they had air support. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces had total air superiority over the battlefield. Japanese planes were occasionally spotted, but they were few and far between. Allied transport planes could drop supplies directly onto the defensive positions, and fighter bombers could strafe and bomb Japanese positions on demand. But in the close quarters fighting that was about to begin, air support would be of limited use. You can't call in a bombing run when the enemy is 10 yards away from your own position. You can't effectively strafe Japanese machine guns that are firing from bunkers dug deep into the hillside and concealed by jungle. The battle for Kohima would be won or lost by men with rifles, grenades and bayonets, fighting yard by yard up and down the slopes of the ridge. As the garrison prepared for the Japanese onslaught, they could hear the sounds of the enemy approaching. Artillery fire echoed from the hills. Patrols brought back reports of large Japanese forces moving through the jungle. The Assam Regiment soldiers who had fought at Jessamy and Karasom told stories of wave attacks, of Japanese soldiers who kept coming despite horrendous casualties, of infiltration tactics that left you never sure if the enemy was in front of you, or behind you, or all around. On the night of April 3rd, Colonel Richards addressed his officers. He told them bluntly that they were facing a Japanese division, perhaps 15,000 men. He told them that reinforcements were on the way but would need time to arrive. He told them their job was to hold, no matter what. If they could hold Kohima, they would deny the Japanese their objective and buy time for Slim's plan to work. If they failed, Imphal would fall, and with it, perhaps all of northeastern India. The officers returned to their units and passed the word. The men on the ridge dug their foxholes a little deeper, checked their ammunition one more time and waited. Many of them wrote letters home, though they couldn't know when or if those letters would be mailed. Some prayed, some tried to sleep, though sleep was difficult with the knowledge of what morning would bring. Some, the veterans of earlier fights, sat quietly and smoked and stared into the darkness,
remembering other battles and other comrades who hadn't lived to fight again. The terrain was set, the forces were in position. All that remained was for the battle to begin. And on the morning of April 4th, 1944, that's exactly what happened. The Japanese had been approaching Kohima for days, but their advance had not been unopposed. Before we get to the main siege, we need to understand the preliminary battles that bought precious time for the garrison to prepare. The first serious fighting occurred at a place called Jasami, a village 50 miles east of Kohima, where Lieutenant Colonel Bruno Brown and his 1st Battalion, Assam Regiment, had established a defensive position directly in the path of the Japanese 138th Infantry Regiment. Brown had about 280 men, a mix of Assam Regiment soldiers and local V-Force irregulars. They had dug in on the hills around Jasami, creating bunkers, foxholes and obstacles. It was a good position, but it was also hopelessly outnumbered. The Japanese attacked Jasami on March 31st. They came in waves, screaming their battle cries, firing as they came. The Assam troops held their fire until the attackers were close, then opened up with everything they had. The first attack was beaten back with heavy Japanese casualties. So was the second, and the third. But the Japanese kept coming, and they brought up their artillery. By the morning of April 2nd, Brown's position was under constant bombardment. Bunkers that had taken days to build were obliterated in seconds. Men died in their foxholes, buried alive by collapsing earth. The Japanese infantry followed the artillery with renewed attacks. They infiltrated between the defensive positions at night, appearing suddenly in the rear. Some of Brown's bunkers changed hands multiple times in savage close quarters fighting. By April 3rd, it was clear that the position couldn't be held much longer. Brown ordered a withdrawal after nightfall. The retreat from Jasami was a nightmare. The Assam troops had to move through Japanese positions in the darkness, with enemy soldiers all around them. Some units never received the order to withdraw and fought to the last man. Others became separated in the jungle and had to make their own way to Kohima. Brown himself, wearing a uniform so tattered that the deputy commissioner would later give him a sweater to wear, led the remnant of his battalion into Kohima on April 4th. Of the 280 men who had fought at Jasami, about 260 made it to Kohima. They were exhausted, many were wounded, some were barefoot, but they had bought 3 precious days. Similar fighting occurred at Karasom, where Captain John Young and another company of Assams held off a Yifsol, Japanese force, for several days. Young's last stand was particularly heroic. When ordered to withdraw, he stayed behind with a small group to cover the retreat. Young and his men fought until they were overrun. The captain himself was never seen again. Colonel Richards would later write that as an example of complete self-sacrifice, nothing could be more magnificent. These delaying actions cost the Japanese time they couldn't afford. General Sato had planned for his division to reach Kohima no later than April 1st, giving them time to capture the town before British reinforcements could arrive. Instead, his lead elements didn't reach the outskirts until April 4th. Those 3 days made all the difference. They allowed the West Kents to arrive. They allowed Richards to organize his defense. They might very well have saved Kohima, but now the Japanese were here, and the real battle was about to begin. The first Japanese probes hit the outlying positions early on April 4th. These weren't full-scale attacks, just reconnaissance in force, feeling out the defenses. The Japanese commanders needed to understand the British positions before committing their full strength. But even these probes were fierce. Japanese infantry, moving through the jungle with practiced ease, appeared suddenly in front of British positions, exchanged fire, then melted back into the undergrowth before artillery could be called in. Colonel Richards watched these probes with growing concern. He could see that the Japanese were preparing for a major assault, and he knew his thin defensive line wouldn't be able to hold everywhere at once. He had to prioritize. Garrison Hill was the key to the position and had to be held at all costs. The DC's bungalow and tennis court were vital ground that commanded the road junction. DS Hill and FSD Hill protected the supply dumps. Everything else was secondary. The evening of April 5th brought the first major attack. As the sun set, Japanese artillery opened up from positions in the surrounding hills. Shells crashed into the defensive positions, sending geysers of earth and shrapnel flying. The bombardment was systematic, walking across the ridge, searching for positions, command posts, ammunition dumps. Then, as darkness fell, the artillery lifted and the infantry came. The attack hit from multiple directions simultaneously, a classic Japanese tactic designed to confuse the defenders and prevent them from shifting reserves to threatened points. To the north, Japanese troops swarmed up the slopes toward Jail Hill. To the east, they attacked Kuki Piquet and DS Hill. To the south, they struck at GPT Ridge. The night erupted in gunfire, explosions, and the screams of men fighting hand to hand in the darkness. The defenders on Jail Hill found themselves under tremendous pressure. Japanese infantry attacked in waves, each wave seeming to appear out of nowhere despite the volume of defensive fire being poured down the slopes. The attackers used the jungle vegetation as cover, advancing in short rushes, then going to ground before the defenders could get a clear shot. When they got close enough, they threw grenades, dozens of them, saturating the defensive positions. Then they charged with bayonets fixed, screaming as they came. The fighting was savage and confused. In the darkness, it was hard to tell friend from foe. British and Indian soldiers fired at muzzle flashes, threw grenades at sounds of movement, and fought hand to hand with whatever they could grab. Entrenching tools became weapons. Rifle butts crushed skulls. Men wrestled in foxholes, fighting for their lives with knives and bare hands. By dawn on April 6th, the Japanese had captured several outlying positions. Kuki Piquet had fallen after fierce fighting. The Japanese had gained a foothold on DS Hill, though the crest remained in British hands. GPT Ridge was contested, with both sides holding parts of it. Jail Hill had held, but barely. The defenders had suffered significant casualties, and more Japanese forces were arriving every hour. Richards looked at his shrinking perimeter and made hard choices. Some positions would have to be abandoned. There simply weren't enough men to hold everything. He pulled his forces back to tighter defensive lines, centered on Garrison Hill, the DC's bungalow area, and the northern part of the ridge. This created a smaller perimeter, easier to defend, but also more vulnerable to concentrated attack. The garrison was now completely surrounded, cut off from Dimapur and the outside world. The wounded presented an immediate crisis. There was no way to evacuate them. The road was cut, and the Japanese controlled the ground on all sides of the perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel John Young, the senior medical officer, had arrived at Kohima just before the siege began, walking through Japanese lines to get there. Now he and his small medical staff worked frantically to care for growing numbers of casualties in makeshift aid stations in cellars and bunkers. Supplies of morphine, bandages, and surgical equipment were already running low. Young performed miracles. On one occasion, knowing that wounded men were dying from cold at the high altitude, he led a party of stretcher bearers at night through Japanese positions to retrieve blankets from trucks that had been abandoned outside the perimeter. During this expedition, Young encountered a Japanese sentry. Rather than alert his comrades, Young killed the man with his bare hands and continued the mission. He returned with 200 blankets that probably saved dozens of lives. The siege had settled into a grim routine. During daylight, the Japanese kept up constant sniper and mortar fire, making any movement suicidal. Snipers were everywhere, hidden in the dense jungle, perched in trees, concealed in the ruins of buildings that had been destroyed by shell fire. They waited patiently for someone to make a mistake, to expose themselves for a second, and then they fired. Men learned to move only when absolutely necessary, crawling from position to position, staying low, staying alive. The Japanese mortars were particularly deadly.
Unlike artillery, which announced its arrival with a whistle or shriek, mortar rounds came silently, plunging from the sky without warning. One moment, you would be hunkered in your foxhole, and the next moment, the world would explode in a spray of earth and metal. If you were lucky, the round landed a few yards away, and you escaped with ringing ears and a coating of dirt. If you were unlucky, you died, often without ever knowing what killed you. Water became critical. The garrison's water points were under constant Japanese fire, making resupply difficult and dangerous. Water parties had to move at night, creeping down the hillside to the wells in the valley, filling their containers in the darkness, while Japanese patrols searched for them, then hauling the heavy containers back up the hill. Some parties never made it back. The wounded, lying in their aid stations, begged for water that often couldn't be provided. Men fighting on the line rationed their canteens carefully, knowing that the next resupply might not come. Food was also rationed strictly. The garrison's supply dumps had taken hits from Japanese artillery, destroying stores of rations. What remained had to be stretched as far as possible. Men went on half rations, then quarter rations. They ate cold food because cooking fires would draw enemy fire. They learned to fight on empty stomachs, ignoring the constant, gnawing hunger. But the biggest crisis was ammunition. The garrison was firing thousands of rounds every day, and resupply was problematic. The Royal Air Force was dropping supplies, but accuracy was an issue. Supply canisters drifting on parachutes might land in British-held positions, or they might land in Japanese-held positions, or they might land in no man's land, where neither side could reach them. Some of the most vicious small unit actions of the siege were fought over supply drops, with both sides scrambling to secure the precious canisters. By April 8th, the perimeter had shrunk again. The Japanese now held most of Dis Hill and were pressing hard against the positions around the DC's bungalow. They had infiltrated to within 50 yards of Garrison Hill in several places. The defenders could hear Japanese soldiers talking and moving just outside their perimeter. At night, Japanese patrols would probe the defensive line, trying to find weak spots, gaps between positions. Sometimes they succeeded, and British soldiers would wake to find Japanese troops inside their perimeter. Colonel Richards sent messages to headquarters describing the situation. His garrison was down to about 2,000 effectives, with casualties mounting daily. Ammunition was running short, water and food were rationed. The wounded were stacking up in the aid stations, with no possibility of evacuation, but the defenders were holding, and every day they held was another day for reinforcements to arrive. Those reinforcements were coming. The 2nd British Division had been rushed across India by rail and was assembling at Dimapur. But getting from Dimapur to Kohima would require a fighting advance through Japanese positions. It would take time, and time was one thing the Kohima garrison didn't have much of. On the night of April 8th to 9th, the Japanese launched their most determined attack yet on Garrison Hill and the DC's bungalow area. The shelling started at dusk and continued for hours, the heaviest bombardment the garrison had yet experienced. Then the infantry came, wave after wave of them, attacking from multiple directions. This was the night that Lance Corporal John Harman earned his Victoria Cross. It was the night when the defense of Kohima came closest to breaking, and it was the night when ordinary soldiers performed acts of extraordinary heroism that would echo through history. If you had to pick a single moment that defined the Battle of Kohima, a moment that captured the intensity, the horror, and the sheer courage of the men who fought there, it would be the defense of Garrison Hill and the tennis court during the 2nd week of April 1944. This is where the battle reached its peak of savage, mindless brutality. This is where men performed acts of valor that seem impossible in the retelling. And this is where the Japanese came closest to breaking through and destroying the garrison. The morning of April 9th began with thick mist clinging to the ridge, reducing visibility to a few yards. The defenders, exhausted after another night of attacks, peered into the grey murk, trying to see what the Japanese had done during the hours of darkness,
The answer soon became clear and terrifying. The Japanese had infiltrated right up to the British positions, and in some cases they had gotten behind them. On Detail Hill, where D Company of the Royal West Kents had been positioned, the men woke to discover that during the night, Japanese engineers had constructed a bunker less than 50 yards behind their main trench line. The bunker was well positioned, dug deep into the hillside, with a machine gun that could sweep most of D Company's positions. Any movement in daylight would be suicidal. The men were effectively pinned down by an enemy position that had appeared as if by magic. This was where Lance Corporal John Harman enters the story. Harman was 29 years old, the son of a wealthy businessman who owned Lundy Island in the Bristol Channel. He had been raised in privilege, but had enlisted in the army in 1941 and had shown a natural aptitude for soldiering despite his distaste for military discipline. His company commander, Major Donald Easton, had recognized something special in Harman, a complete indifference to danger, an almost eerie calm under fire, and an unshakable belief that he would not die in battle. Harman had told his friends that fortune tellers had predicted he would survive the war, and he genuinely seemed to believe it. On the morning of April 9th, with his company pinned down by the Japanese bunker, Harman decided to do something about it. Without telling anyone what he planned, he simply stood up, grabbed a grenade, and charged. Imagine the scene. Harman running across open ground in broad daylight, exposed to fire from every direction, while his comrades watched in stunned disbelief. The Japanese in the bunker opened fire, but somehow, impossibly, they missed. Harman reached the bunker, pulled the pin on his grenade, and threw it through the firing slit. He dove to the side just as it exploded inside the bunker, killing the crew. Then, while the bunker was still smoking, Harman climbed inside, picked up the Japanese machine gun, and carried it back to the British lines as a trophy. His comrades were dumbfounded. Major Easton tried to speak to him, but Harman just grinned and said there were 2 dead Japanese in the bunker. Then he calmly cleaned his rifle and prepared for whatever came next. The next morning, Easter Sunday, April 9th, Harman did it again. At dawn, he noticed that during the night, a party of Japanese soldiers had dug in on the slope above D Company's position, close enough to throw grenades into the British trenches. Without waiting for orders or support, Harman ordered covering fire from his Bren gun team, grabbed his rifle with bayonet fixed, and charged the Japanese position alone. He shot 4 of the enemy soldiers and bayoneted a 5th. The surviving Japanese fled. Harman started back toward his own lines, probably thinking that fortune had smiled on him once again. But this time, his luck ran out. A burst of machine gun fire from another Japanese position hit him in the side. He staggered and fell, but somehow managed to crawl back to the British trenches. Major Easton rushed to his aid, pulling Harman into cover and calling for medics. Harman was conscious, though badly wounded. His final words were a whisper. "I got the lot. It was worth it." He died in Easton's arms minutes later. For his actions on April 8th and 9th, John Harman was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for valour. The citation read that his heroic action and supreme devotion to duty were largely responsible for the decisive way in which all attacks were driven off by his company. It was one of only 2 Victoria Crosses awarded during the Battle of Kohima, and it was richly deserved. But Harman's sacrifice, as magnificent as it was just one story among thousands. Every position on the ridge had its own tales of desperate courage, of men pushed beyond their limits and somehow finding the strength to continue. On Garrison Hill itself, the defenders were under constant attack. The Japanese had established positions on Kuki Piquet, just 50 yards away from the British trenches. The 2 sides were so close that they could hear each other talking, could smell the smoke from each other's cigarettes. At night, the Japanese would attack across that tiny gap, and the fighting would dissolve into chaos. Men fought with bayonets, rifle butts, entrenching tools, and bare hands. The darkness
was filled with explosions, muzzle flashes, screams, and the wet sounds of hand-to-hand combat. A British sergeant described the grenade exchanges as being like a snowball fight, except each snowball was packed with TNT and could blow you apart if it landed anywhere near you. The defenders learned to count 1, 2, 3 seconds from the plop of a grenade launcher firing until the grenade arrived. If you were quick, you could dive for cover. If you weren't, well, there were always replacements. The tennis court area became the focal point of the most intense fighting. The Japanese held the deputy commissioner's bungalow, or what was left of it after days of shelling. The British held positions in the terraces above the tennis court. Between them, the court itself became a deadly no-man's land. Corpses from both sides littered the court, but neither side could retrieve their dead because any movement drew instant fire. The Japanese tried repeatedly to break through at the tennis court. They would shell the British positions with artillery and mortars, then attack with infantry, sometimes preceded by smoke grenades that created a screen across the court. The British defenders would wait until the Japanese were committed to the attack, then open up with everything they had: rifles, machine guns, mortars, and sometimes even the field guns firing from Jotsoma. The noise during these attacks was indescribable. The crack of rifles, the heavy thump of mortars, the chatter of machine guns, the screams of wounded and dying men, the roar of artillery shells overhead, it all blended into a continuous thunder that went on for hours. Men's ears bled from the concussion. They shouted to be heard over the din, but often couldn't make themselves understood, even when screaming at the top of their lungs. And then there was the smell. Bodies that couldn't be buried quickly rotted in the tropical heat. The stench of death hung over the entire battlefield, so thick that men vomited when they first caught the full force of it. The air itself seemed corrupted. Men ate their meager rations while sitting next to corpses because there was nowhere else to sit. They learned to breathe through their mouths, to ignore the smell, to function in conditions that would have seemed impossible before the battle began. The wounded suffered terribly. The aid stations were overflowing, with 600 seriously wounded men lying in cellars and bunkers, many of them in agony. Morphine was running out. Bandages were in short supply. Some wounds became infected in the heat and humidity, and without proper antibiotics, men died of infections that would have been easily treatable in a hospital. The doctors and medics worked around the clock, performing surgery in candlelight, amputating limbs without anesthesia when they had to, trying desperately to save as many lives as possible with grossly inadequate resources. Water remained a critical issue. The garrison's main water point was under Japanese observation and fire. Men died trying to fetch water. The wounded begged for it constantly, their thirst made worse by a blood loss and shock. Rations of water were cut to a pint per man per day, barely enough to survive, much less to fight effectively in the heat. Food supplies were also dwindling. Supply drops helped, but many of the containers fell into Japanese-held areas or into no man's land where they couldn't be recovered. The defenders were on quarter rations, eating cold, corned beef and hardtack biscuits, supplemented occasionally by whatever could be scavenged. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing at men's strength and morale. Ammunition shortages were perhaps the worst problem. Men were ordered to conserve ammunition, to make every shot count, to hold their fire until they had a clear target. This went against every instinct when facing a massed attack, but there was no choice. If they ran out of ammunition, the position would fall. Machine gunners counted their rounds obsessively. Mortar crews calculated how many rounds they had left and tried to save them for the most critical moments. The Japanese, meanwhile, were suffering their own problems, though the British defenders didn't know it yet. General Sato's logistics were collapsing, the supplies he had brought with him were running out, and the roads back to Burma were under constant air attack. The thousands of cattle that were supposed to provide both transportation and emergency rations had largely died on the march. Japanese soldiers were starting to go hungry, a problem that would grow worse as the siege continued. But hunger didn't stop them from attacking. Throughout mid-April, the Japanese mounted assault after assault on Garrison Hill and the tennis court. They would shell the positions until it seemed impossible that anyone could survive, then send in wave after wave of infantry. The British defenders, reduced to holding a perimeter barely 350 yards square, hung on through sheer determination. Colonel Richards, commanding from his bunker on Garrison Hill, could see his garrison being whittled away. Casualties were mounting, and there were no replacements. Units that had started the siege with 100 men were down to 30 or 40. Positions that should have been held by a platoon were being defended by a handful of exhausted soldiers. On April 14th, he sent a message to headquarters. "The men's spirits are all right, but there aren't many of us left." It was a masterpiece of British understatement. The defenders were at the end of their endurance. They hadn't slept properly in days. They were starving, dehydrated, and shell-shocked. Many were wounded, but still fighting because there was no one to replace them. A young private asked Colonel Richards, "When we die, sir, is that the end, or do we go on?" It was the kind of question men ask when they've accepted that death is coming and are just trying to understand it. Yet somehow, they held. When the Japanese attacked Garrison Hill on the night of April 17th, in what everyone knew was an all-out attempt to break through, the defenders met them with everything they had left. Phosphorus shells turned night into day. Grenades flew back and forth across the tiny perimeter. Men fired until their rifle barrels were too hot to touch, then picked up the weapons of the fallen and kept firing. By dawn on April 18th, the attack had been beaten back once again. The ground around Garrison Hill was carpeted with Japanese dead. The defenders, those who were still alive, sat in their foxholes in a state of near collapse. They had done the impossible. They had held, but they couldn't hold much longer. If relief didn't come soon, the next Japanese attack would be the last. And then, at dawn on April 18th, the men on the ridge heard a sound that seemed like a miracle. The roar of tank engines, the crack of 75mm guns, the sound of thousands of fresh troops advancing up the road from Jotsoma. The 2nd British Division had arrived. The siege was about to be broken. The advance of the 2nd British Division toward Kohima had been anything but easy. These were veteran troops, battalions like the Royal Scots, the Durham Light Infantry, the Royal Berkshires, and the Dorsetshire Regiment. Many of them had fought at Dunkirk before being sent to India. They were experienced soldiers, well-trained and well-led, but they had never faced an enemy quite like the Japanese, and they had never fought in terrain quite like the Naga Hills. Major General John Grover, commanding the division, had pushed his men hard in the race to reach Kohima. They had been rushed across India by rail, then force-marched up the road from Dimapur. Along the way, they had encountered Japanese roadblocks and defensive positions that had to be reduced one by one. Every mile closer to Kohima was paid for in casualties. The final approach to Kohima had been particularly difficult. The Japanese had established a strong roadblock at a point marked as mile 45 on the road from Dimapur. Here, the road ran through a narrow defile between steep hills covered in jungle. The Japanese had dug in on the heights overlooking the road, creating a killing zone that had to be crossed under fire. It took the lead elements of the division most of April 17th to force their way through, with supporting fire from tanks and artillery. By the night of April 17th, the 1st Battalion, 1st Punjab Regiment, from the 161st Indian Brigade, had fought their way to Sochi, positions just west of Garrison Hill. They were close enough to see the battered defenders, close enough to hear the sounds of fighting. But between them and the garrison lay Japanese positions that would have to be cleared. The breakout began at dawn on April 18th. As the rising sun burned off the morning mist, Hawker Hurricane fighter bombers screamed in low over the ridge, dropping bombs and strafing Japanese positions. Artillery from Jotsoma hammered targets that had been carefully plotted over the previous days.
and then the infantry went in. The men of the 1st Punjab, supported by tanks of the 149th Regiment Royal Armoured Corps, attacked toward Garrison Hill. The Japanese, seeing fresh troops and armour, fought with desperate courage, but they were caught between the relieving force and the garrison defenders. Men of the West Kents, who had been defending for 2 weeks, suddenly found themselves able to go on the offensive. They burst out of their foxholes, screaming, firing, bayoneting anyone in their path. The link-up happened shortly before noon. Punjabi and British soldiers embraced each other, laughing and crying. The siege was broken. The defenders, those who could still walk, began to be evacuated. They staggered down from the ridge, many of them barely able to stand, and were loaded onto trucks that would take them to hospitals in Dimapur. Of the 446 men of the 4th Battalion, Royal West Kent Regiment, who had marched into Kohima on April 4th, 278 were casualties, over 60%. Similar casualty rates ran through all the defending units. Colonel Richards was among the last to leave, as befitted a commander. He watched as fresh troops took over the positions his men had held for 2 weeks. When he finally climbed into a truck to leave Garrison Hill, soldiers of the relieving force stood and applauded. They understood what these men had done, what they had endured. Richards himself later wrote that he made his way up Garrison Hill for the last time and watched the relief going on, feeling a complex mixture of relief, pride and sorrow for the men who hadn't lived to see this moment. But the battle for Kohima was far from over. Breaking the siege was one thing, driving the Japanese off the ridge entirely was another. The Japanese still held most of the town, including the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow, the tennis court, much of Naga village, and the entire southern end of the ridge. They were dug in deep, with bunkers that had been reinforced over 2 weeks of siege. They had no intention of giving up. General Grover now had to plan a deliberate attack to clear the Japanese from their positions. He had 3 brigades of the 2nd Division available, roughly 15,000 men. Facing them were elements of Sato's 31st Division, perhaps 8,000 men still combat effective, though that number would decline as starvation and disease took their toll. The fighting that followed over the next month was some of the most intense of the entire battle. The British couldn't just charge the Japanese positions. The terrain was too broken, the bunkers too strong, the defenders too determined. Instead, Grover adopted a methodical approach. He would use artillery and tanks to blast Japanese positions, then send in infantry to clear the rubble. It was slow, bloody work. The tennis court remained a particular focus. On May 10th, British tanks supported by the Dorsetshire Regiment launched an attack to recapture it. The lead tank, driven by Sergeant Waterhouse, advanced to within 20 yards of Japanese bunkers, firing its 75mm gun directly into the firing slits at point-blank range. Behind the tank came the infantry, clearing bunker after bunker with grenades and bayonets. The tennis court was finally recaptured, though the fighting continued on the slopes above and below it. This phase of the battle produced the 2nd Victoria Cross awarded at Kohima. On May 4th, Captain John Randle of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Norfolk Regiment, was commanding B Company in an attack on Japanese positions on GPT Ridge. The attack ran into trouble when Randle's company commander was severely wounded. Randle took command and, despite being wounded himself in the knee by grenade fragments, organized a successful assault that captured the company's objective. 2 days later, on May 6th, Randle's company was ordered to attack a particularly strong Japanese bunker that was holding up the entire advance. Previous attacks had failed with heavy casualties. Randle led his men forward at dawn, but one platoon was pinned down by machine gun fire from a bunker on the reverse slope of the ridge. Randle could see that the bunker's position allowed it to fire into the rear of the British advance and threatened the entire attack's success. Without hesitation, Randle charged the bunker alone, carrying his rifle with fixed bayonet. Japanese machine gunners opened fire, hitting him multiple times in the face and body. Mortally wounded, Randle somehow kept going. He reached the bunker and threw a grenade through the firing slit, silencing the gun. Then, with his last strength, he flung his body across the slit to ensure that no more fire could come from it. He saved the lives of many of his men and enabled the battalion to capture its objective. He was 26 years old. Captain Randle's Victoria Cross citation noted that the bravery shown by this officer could not have been surpassed, and that by his self-sacrifice, he saved the lives of many of his men and enabled not only his own company, but the whole battalion to gain its objective and win a decisive victory. His father later collected the Victoria Cross from Buckingham Palace. Poignantly, Randle's brother-in-law, Flying Officer Leslie Thomas Manser, had also been awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross in 1942 for remaining at the controls of his burning bomber so his crew could bail out. 2 brothers-in-law, 2 Victoria Crosses, 2 supreme sacrifices. The fighting dragged on through May. The monsoon had started, turning the battlefield into a quagmire. Rain fell in sheets, reducing visibility to yards and turning the steep slopes into rivers of mud. Men slipped and slid as they tried to advance. Foxholes filled with water, equipment rusted. Wounds became infected in the constant damp. The misery was indescribable. The Japanese fought with the determination of men who knew they were losing but refused to give up. They turned every bunker, every trench, every shell hole into a fortress that had to be taken by storm. Some positions changed hands multiple times. The casualty rate was horrific on both sides. In places, the British had to cut steps into the hillside and build handrails just to move forward, while Japanese machine gunners waited at the top. Slowly, inexorably, the British ground forward. They recaptured Naga village after bitter fighting. They cleared the slopes around Garrison Hill. They pushed the Japanese back from the tennis court and the deputy commissioner's bungalow. By the middle of May, the Japanese were clearly losing. They had no supplies, no reinforcements, no hope of victory. But they fought on. General Sato was watching his division disintegrate. His men were starving. Casualties from combat, disease, and starvation were mounting daily. He had pleaded with 15th Army headquarters for supplies, for permission to withdraw, for anything that would save his division. The responses he received were evasive or contradictory, or simply ignored his situation. On May 25th, Sato sent a message to Mutaguchi. Unless supplies arrived within 48 hours, he would have to withdraw. It was an ultimatum from a subordinate to his commanding officer, something virtually unheard of in the Japanese army. Mutaguchi's response was to order Sato to hold his positions and send part of his division to support the attacks on Imphal. Sato received this order with contempt. His men were dying of starvation, and Mutaguchi wanted him to split his force and attack in another direction. On May 31st, Sato made his decision. Without orders, without permission, in direct violation of every principle of Japanese military discipline, he ordered his division to withdraw. It was an act of insubordination that would have dramatic consequences for his career, but Sato was past caring about his career. He was trying to save whatever remained of his division. As he left Kohima, he sent a final message. Our swords are broken, and our arrows spent. Shedding bitter tears, I now leave Kohima. The road to Imphal was about to be reopened, and Operation Yugo was about to collapse into one of the greatest defeats in Japanese military history. But first, we need to understand the role played by the people whose land had become a battlefield. The Naga. The Battle of Kohima was not fought in a vacuum. It was fought on land that belonged to the Naga people, an indigenous ethnic group who had inhabited these hills for centuries before the British arrived, before the Japanese arrived, before anyone thought to draw borders and claim sovereignty. For the Nagas, this was their home, and the war had come to them uninvited. Understanding the Naga perspective is crucial to understanding the full story of Kohima. These were not passive bystanders watching from a distance. They were active participants whose contribution to the Allied victory was both substantial and often overlooked in mainstream histories of the battle. The Nagas are actually a collection of different tribes, each with its own distinct language, customs, and traditions. Before the arrival of the British in the mid-19th century, they had lived in relative isolation, practicing shifting agriculture, maintaining their village-based political systems, and occasionally engaging in warfare with neighboring tribes. One custom that had earned them a fearsome reputation was headhunting, though this practice had largely ended by the 1940s thanks to the influence of Christian missionaries who had been active in the region since the late 19th century. When the British established administrative control over the Naga Hills in the late 1800s, it was more of a nominal control than anything else. The Nagas were left largely to manage their own affairs, with a British Deputy Commissioner serving as a liaison and administrator rather than a direct ruler. Charles Pawsey, the Deputy Commissioner whose bungalow would become the focal point of the Battle of Kohima, was well liked and respected by the Naga community. He spoke their languages, understood their customs, and treated them with respect unusual for colonial administrators of his era. When war came to Kohima in April 1944, the Naga people faced an impossible situation. Their villages were in the direct path of the Japanese advance. Their fields and homes became battlegrounds. Their people were caught between two massive military forces, neither of which had much concern for civilian casualties. By all rights, the Nagas could have tried to stay neutral, to simply flee to safer areas and wait out the fighting. Some did, but many chose instead to actively support the British and Indian forces. Why? The reasons are complex. Some Nagas supported the British because they saw them as protectors who had maintained relative peace in the region. Risota Rhino, a Naga who participated in the battle, explained it simply. Why did we fight for the British? They were our protectors. They were here before the Japanese, and they protected us. We had to help them. Others supported the British for more pragmatic reasons. The Japanese, desperate for food as their supply lines collapsed, had begun forcibly taking what little the Naga had. Naga villages that had cooperated with the Japanese found themselves stripped of their rice stores, their livestock, their possessions. Anger toward the Japanese grew as hunger drove Japanese soldiers to increasingly desperate acts. One Naga woman recalled carrying a basket with a chicken on top. Japanese soldiers simply lifted the chicken and took it away without saying anything, leaving her with nothing. But there was also a deeper calculation at work. The Nagas understood, perhaps better than anyone, that this battle was about more than just military objectives. The outcome would determine who controlled their land, who set the rules by which they lived. Many Nagas concluded that their interests were better served by a British victory than a Japanese one. The contribution the Nagas made to the Allied war effort at Kohima was enormous and took many forms. Perhaps, most importantly, they served as scouts and guides. The terrain around Kohima was incredibly complex, with a maze of tracks, paths, and trails through the dense jungle that only locals knew. Naga scouts led British patrols through this maze, helping them avoid Japanese positions or set up ambushes. They knew where water could be found, which routes were passable, which hills commanded which valleys. Major General Grover, commanding the 2nd Division, wrote with admiration about the Nagas. They offer to take on any job, usually of an intelligence nature, to visit some village behind Japanese lines, or to provide porters or guides whenever required, and offer to do all this for nothing. We are insisting on paying them. One has been taught to regard the Nagas as savage headhunters. I have found nothing but loyalty, courage, and generosity. The Nagas also served as porters, carrying supplies up the steep hillsides to forward positions where vehicles couldn't go. This was backbreaking work, A typical porter load was 60 pounds of ammunition, food or medical supplies, carried up slopes so steep that you had to use your hands to climb in places, in heat and humidity that sapped your strength, often under Japanese fire. Older Nagas who participated in the battle remember the work with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. Kuo Kesieje, who served as a porter at the age of 108 when she was interviewed decades later, vividly recalled hurrying home after dropping off a load of supplies and realizing she still had an ammunition belt on her shoulder. She chuckled at the memory, but the work itself had been no laughing matter. Naga stretcher bearers performed perhaps the most dangerous work of all. When British and Indian soldiers were wounded in forward positions, someone had to carry them back to the aid stations. This meant carrying a stretcher, which required 4 men and made them highly visible targets, across ground that was often under direct fire. Many Naga stretcher bearers were killed or wounded while performing this humanitarian service. They carried wounded men of all nationalities, British, Indian, Nepalese, making no distinction, asking no questions, simply doing what needed to be done. Some Naga served as combatants. When rifles were available, Naga men who volunteered were armed and fought alongside British and Indian troops. They proved to be excellent shots and fearless fighters. The tradition of headhunting, though officially ended, meant that Naga warriors had a cultural comfort with close combat that served them well in the brutal fighting around Kohima. But perhaps the most important contribution the Nagas made was in intelligence. They moved freely through the countryside in ways that British soldiers couldn't, observing Japanese positions, counting troops, noting where supplies were being stockpiled. This information was invaluable for planning attacks and avoiding ambushes. Naga intelligence gatherers risked torture and death if captured by the Japanese, but they continued their work throughout the battle. The cost the Naga people paid for their support of the Allied cause was enormous. Several Naga villages that had been in the battle zone were completely destroyed, reduced to burned ruins by artillery and airstrikes. Kwozu Viso, 98 years old when interviewed, remembered returning to her village after the battle ended and finding it burned and blackened. "I still wonder how they even knew which land belonged to whom when they started rebuilding the village," she said. The sight of her destroyed home had been, in her words, as spellbinding as a rice field golden and ripe for harvest, though in this case it was a landscape of devastation. The Nagas also had to deal with the grim aftermath of the battle. Thousands of Japanese soldiers had died in the fighting or during the retreat. Their bodies littered the countryside, decomposing in the tropical heat. Naga villagers, returning to their homes after the fighting moved on, found themselves burying the dead. Nadalie, 13 years old during the battle, recalled, "We were elated at the thought of going back home, but on the way back we saw many dead Japanese soldiers. After some time I grew tired of counting and looking at the dead soldiers, all of whom looked alike now that they were bloated and decomposing by the roadside." Her group tried to bury the bodies at first, but eventually gave up because there were simply too many. The battlefield itself remained dangerous for decades after. Unexploded ordnance, mines, grenades, all the deadly debris of war remained scattered across the landscape. In 1976, a tragic reminder of this danger occurred when 8 children were killed while playing in Kohima village when a World War II-era bomb exploded. The war had ended more than 30 years earlier, but its echoes still killed. The Battle of Kohima also had profound effects on Naga society and political consciousness. Before the war, the Nagas had lived in relative isolation from the wider world. The battle brought them into contact with soldiers from Britain, India, Nepal, Africa, and Japan. They were exposed to radios, aircraft, modern weapons, and ideas about nationalism and self-determination. Many historians believe that this exposure helped catalyze the emergence of modern Naga political consciousness and the subsequent movement for Naga autonomy. Some Nagas had actually supported the Japanese, believing that Japanese victory might help the Nagas achieve independence from British rule. The Indian National Army, which fought alongside the Japanese, had promised independence for all of India, and some Nagas saw this as their path to self-governance. B.K. Sachu, who was a child during the battle, recalled the kindness of a Japanese doctor who treated sick children despite having few medical supplies. "From him, I understood how good the Japanese were," he said, highlighting that the war was not a simple story of good versus evil, but rather a complex conflict in which different Naga people made different choices based on their own understanding of their interests. In the decades after the war, the contribution of the Naga people to the Allied victory at Kohima was often overlooked or minimized in mainstream histories. The battle was remembered as a British and Indian achievement, with the Naga relegated to a footnote if mentioned at all. This began to change in recent years as historians and veterans recognized that without Naga support, the battle might well have ended differently. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of the battle, British veterans who had fought at Kohima established the Kohima Educational Trust as a debt of honor to the Naga people. The trust provides scholarships and educational resources to Naga children, using the past to benefit the future. It's seen by its founders as both a means of sustaining the memory of the battle and of honoring the Nagas who were their allies. Major Gordon Graham, A. and Barr, a Cameron Highlander who fought at Kohima and later became one of the founders of the trust, always maintained that without the help of the Naga, the British and Commonwealth soldiers could not have won the battle, and certainly would not have survived in the numbers they did. His words captured a truth that has become increasingly recognized. The Battle of Kohima was not just a British or Indian victory. It was also a Naga victory, won by people defending their homeland with courage and resourcefulness. Today, the Kohima War Cemetery is maintained jointly by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and the Government of Nagaland. It stands as a memorial not just to the Commonwealth soldiers who died there, but also to the Naga people who supported them. Local Naga students maintain the graves, ensuring that the cemetery remains a place of dignity and remembrance. It's a partnership that speaks to the enduring bond created in the crucible of battle. The story of the Nagas at Kohima reminds us that every war, no matter how large or small, affects civilians caught in its path. And sometimes, those civilians become more than victims. They become participants, allies, heroes in their own right. The Naga people were all of these things at Kohima, and their story deserves to be remembered alongside the soldiers who fought there. As May turned to June in 1944, General Sato faced a situation that was rapidly moving from difficult to catastrophic. His 31st Division, which had started Operation Yugo with 15,000 men, was disintegrating. Casualties from combat, disease and starvation had reduced his effective strength to barely 6,000 men, and that number was falling every day. The supply situation had gone from bad to impossible. The elaborate plans for resupply that Mutaguchi had drawn up had never materialized. The pack animals were dead, the roads were under constant air attack, and the British had recaptured stretches of the Kohima-Imphal road, making even the delivery of basic supplies impossible. Sato's men were eating grass, leaves, anything they could find in the jungle. Many were too weak from hunger to fight effectively. Disease was rampant, with dysentery, malaria, and other tropical illnesses sweeping through units that had no medical supplies to treat them. The physical state of the Japanese soldiers by late May was appalling. Men who had been hardened combat veterans just weeks earlier now looked like walking skeletons. Their uniforms hung on emaciated frames. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken, skin stretched tight over bones. Many could barely walk, much less fight. And yet they continued to fight, driven by a combination of discipline, desperation, and the knowledge that retreat without orders meant certain court-martial. Sato watched his division dying and became increasingly bitter toward Mutaguchi and the 15th Army headquarters. The orders he received seemed disconnected from reality. Mutaguchi wanted him to hold Kohima, while simultaneously sending part of his division to support attacks on Imphal. Sato knew this was insane. His division was barely holding on as it was. Splitting it would ensure the destruction of both halves. On May 25th, Sato sent his ultimatum: withdraw within 48 hours or his division would collapse. Mutaguchi's response was to order him to continue the attack. At this point, something in Sato snapped. He had done his duty. He had attacked as ordered, fought with everything he had, pushed his men beyond the limits of endurance. And for what? So that Mutaguchi could pursue a fantasy of marching on Delhi while Japanese soldiers starved in the hills? On May 31st, Sato gave the order to withdraw. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for approval. He simply ordered his division to begin pulling back from Kohima. For a Japanese general to retreat without orders was virtually unprecedented. It violated every principle of military discipline that the Imperial Japanese Army held sacred. Sato knew this would probably end his career, possibly even his life. He didn't care. He was trying to save what was left of his division. The withdrawal from Kohima was conducted with the same professionalism that had marked the initial attack. Japanese rearguards held positions to cover the retreat of the main force. Units pulled back in stages, leapfrogging each other to maintain a defensive line. Despite their desperate condition, Sato's men maintained discipline, gathering their wounded when they could, destroying equipment they couldn't carry, making sure the British couldn't easily pursue. But the retreat quickly turned into a nightmare. The monsoon was in full force now, with torrential rains that turned the tracks through the jungle into rivers of mud. Men slipped and fell on the steep mountain paths. Those too weak to walk were left behind, given a grenade or a pistol and told to kill themselves rather than be captured. It was understood that capture meant interrogation, possibly torture. And the Japanese army preferred that its soldiers die rather than risk revealing military secrets. The British and Indian forces pursued, but even they found the going difficult in the monsoon. The same rain that hampered the Japanese retreat also slowed the pursuit. Tanks and vehicles bogged down in the mud, supply lines stretched thin. But gradually, steadily, the British pushed forward, clearing Japanese positions one by one. On June 22, 1944, troops advancing from Kohima met up with forces advancing from Imphal at milestone 109 on the road between the two towns. The siege of Imphal was broken. The road was open. Operation U-Go had failed completely. The cost of this failure was staggering. Of the approximately 85,000 Japanese soldiers who participated in Operation U-Go, 53,000 became casualties. Some were killed in combat. More died of starvation or disease during the retreat. The 15th Army was shattered as an effective fighting force. It would never recover. At Kohima, specifically, Sato's division of 15,000 men lost 6,400 killed, wounded, or dead of disease during the battle itself. Another 2,800 required immediate hospitalization after returning to Burma, many of them so malnourished and sick that they would never return to duty. That left fewer than 6,000 men fit for service out of the original 15,000, a casualty rate of 60%. The retreat has been called the Road of Bones because of the thousands of Japanese soldiers who died along the tracks through the jungle. Allied patrols following the retreating Japanese found bodies every few yards, men who had simply collapsed and died of exhaustion, starvation, or disease. In some places, the smell of decomposition was so strong that patrols had to wear gas masks. The jungle reclaimed many of these bodies, but even decades later, hikers in the Naga hills would occasionally find bones, helmets, equipment, silent testimony to the catastrophe that had befallen the Japanese 15th Army. The consequences for the Japanese commanders were swift and severe. Mutaguchi was relieved of command on July 30th and recalled to Tokyo. He was never given another field command. The disaster of Operation Yugo had destroyed his career, though he never accepted responsibility for the failure, instead blaming his subordinate commanders. Sato's case was more complex. He was relieved of command on July 7th, weeks after his unauthorized retreat. Mutaguchi, in a final act of spite, suggested that Sato should commit seppuku, ritual suicide, to atone for his insubordination. Sato refused. Instead, he demanded a court-martial where he could publicly expose Mutaguchi's incompetence and the flawed planning that had doomed Operation Yugo from the start. This put the Japanese High Command in an awkward position. They didn't want a public court-martial that would expose the weaknesses in their planning and command structure. On the prompting of Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe, commander of Burma Area Army, military doctors declared that Sato had suffered a mental breakdown and was unfit to stand trial. On November 23, 1944, he was quietly retired on medical grounds. Sato spent the rest of the war in Japan and devoted his post-war years to assisting surviving members of his division. He never wavered in his conviction that his decision to withdraw had been necessary to save his men's lives and that the charges of insanity were unjustified. In 1959, Sato died, still maintaining that he had done the right thing, that duty to his men had outweighed duty to obey an order that would have resulted in their pointless deaths. Modern historians have largely vindicated Sato's decision. The logistics of Operation Yugo were indeed fatally flawed. Mutaguchi's planning had been based more on wishful thinking than realistic assessment. Sato's warnings had been prescient. His decision to withdraw while technically insubordination saved thousands of lives that would otherwise have been wasted in a futile defense of an untenable position. For the Allied forces, the victory at Kohima and Imphal was transformative. It had been the largest battle fought by the British Army in the Second World War in terms of numbers engaged. The Japanese had been decisively defeated in a straight fight, their aura of invincibility shattered. The myth that Japanese soldiers were unbeatable jungle fighters had been destroyed. British, Indian, and Commonwealth troops had met the Japanese on their own terms in terrain that favored the defenders and had won. The victory opened the door for the reconquest of Burma. With the Japanese 15th Army shattered, General Slim could begin the offensive that would eventually recapture Mandalay, Meiktila, and finally Rangoon. The road that had been the focus of such desperate fighting at Kohima became the lifeline for this offensive, carrying supplies and reinforcements south into Burma. The human cost had been terrible. British and Indian forces lost over 4,000 casualties at Kohima alone, with similar numbers at Imphal. Thousands more would be casualties during the subsequent Burma Campaign. But these casualties had brought a victory that shortened the war in Asia and saved countless lives in the long run. As the survivors of both sides made their way from the battlefield, they left behind a landscape transformed by war. The pleasant hill station was gone, replaced by a moonscape of shell craters, ruined buildings, and shallow graves. The tennis court where friends had once played now held the bodies of hundreds of men from both sides. The terraced gardens were torn apart by shellfire. The jungle had been reduced to shattered stumps and splintered logs. But in the end, Kohima had been held. The road had been opened. The Japanese had been turned back. It had been, as Field Marshal Slim would later write, one of the greatest battles in history. And like all great battles, it had been won not by grand strategy or superior resources, though these mattered, but by the courage and endurance of individual soldiers who had found within themselves the strength to do what seemed impossible. The Battle of Kohima ended on June 22, 1944, when British forces from Kohima linked up with forces from Imphal at milestone 109. But in a very real sense, the battle never ended. Its echoes continue to this day, in the memories of survivors, in the monuments and cemeteries that mark the battlefield, and in the lessons it teaches about war, sacrifice, and the human capacity for both destruction and nobility. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, there was a massive cleanup operation to undertake. The battlefield was littered with thousands of dead from both sides, many of them in advanced states of decomposition in the tropical heat. Graves registration units worked tirelessly to recover bodies, identify them when possible, and provide proper burial. Commonwealth soldiers were eventually gathered in what would become the Kohima War Cemetery. Hindu and Sikh soldiers from the Indian Army, whose religious practices required cremation rather than burial, were cremated on the battlefield, and their names were inscribed on the Kohima Cremation Memorial. The Japanese dead presented a more difficult problem. With no Japanese forces in the area to claim them, many were buried where they fell in mass graves. Some were never buried at all, their bones scattered across the hillsides, slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. In the decades after the war, Japanese tourists and veterans would make pilgrimages to Kohima, searching for the remains of relatives who had never returned from the battle. Some remains were found and repatriated to Japan. Many more were never recovered. The creation of the Kohima War Cemetery took several years. The cemetery was designed by Colin St. Clair Oakes and built on the site where the fiercest fighting had occurred, the terraces around the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow and the famous tennis court. The cemetery is completely terraced, with levels ranging from 3 to 5 meters in height, following the natural contours of the battlefield. White headstones, each marking a Commonwealth soldier who died in the battle, stand in neat rows on these terraces. At the highest point in the cemetery stands the Cross of Sacrifice, a standard feature in Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries worldwide. Below it is the Kohima Cremation Memorial, which commemorates 917 Hindu and Sikh soldiers whose remains were cremated in accordance with their faith. The memorial bears inscriptions in English and Gurmukhi script. At the lower end of the cemetery, near the entrance, stands the memorial to the 2nd British Division. It's a simple stone monument, 15 feet tall, made from a Naga obelisk that once stood near the village of Maram. The Nagas gave permission for it to be moved to Kohima to commemorate the division. On this monument is inscribed the epitaph that has become one of the most famous from any war. When you go home, tell them of us and say, "For your tomorrow, we gave our today." This epitaph, known as the Kohima Epitaph, was written by John Maxwell Edmonds, a classical scholar and World War I codebreaker. He had originally composed it in 1918 as one of several epitaphs intended for war memorials, inspired by the ancient Greek epitaph written by Simonides of Chios for the Spartans who died at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC. The epitaph was adapted slightly when it was selected for the Kohima Memorial, changing "these gave their today" to "we gave our today," making it more personal, more immediate, as if the dead themselves were speaking. The words capture something profound about the nature of sacrifice in war. The soldiers who died at Kohima, whether they were 20 years old or 40, whether they came from London or Delhi or Kathmandu, gave up all their tomorrows, all the years they might have lived, all the experiences they would never have, so that others could have a future. It's a debt that can never be repaid, only remembered and honored. The cemetery also contains the tennis court itself, carefully marked out on the ground where it stood during the battle. Standing on that court today, it's almost impossible to imagine what it must have been like when Japanese soldiers held one baseline and British soldiers held the other, when grenades flew back and forth across the net, when men fought hand to hand over every square yard. It's a peaceful place now, beautifully maintained, with flowers blooming on the terraces, but the spirits of those who fought there still seem to linger. Field Marshal Sir William Slim, who had commanded the 14th Army, during the battle, came back to Kohima after the war to inaugurate the cemetery. Standing among the graves of men who had served under his command, Slim said that sieges have been longer, but few have been more intense, and in none have the defenders deserved greater honor than the garrison of Kohima. Lord Louis Mountbatten, Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia, visited the battlefield and commented that the Battle of Kohima will probably go down as one of the greatest battles in history. For the British and Commonwealth nations, Kohima came to be seen as one of the defining battles of the Second World War. In 2013, the British National Army Museum conducted a poll asking the public to vote for Britain's greatest battle. The results surprised many. Kohima and Imphal, fought jointly, took the top spot, ahead of Waterloo, Trafalgar Wellington, D-Day, and all the other famous victories in British military history. The voting reflected a growing recognition that what happened in the hills of Nagaland in 1944 was something truly exceptional. Several factors contributed to this recognition. First was the sheer scale of the achievement. A garrison of fewer than 2,500 men, many of them non-combat troops, had held off a Japanese division of 15,000 for 2 weeks. The odds were so overwhelming that the garrison's survival seemed almost miraculous. Second was the intensity of the fighting. Veterans from European battlefields who saw Kohima after the battle were shocked by the devastation. The ground was more heavily cratered than anything they had seen on the Western Front. The density of firepower concentrated in such a small area, the proximity of the opposing forces, the savage nature of the hand-to-hand combat, all contributed to what one historian called combat of mindless savagery. Third was the strategic importance. If Kohima had fallen, Imphal would have fallen. If Imphal had fallen, the Allied position in northeastern India would have collapsed, potentially opening the way for a Japanese invasion of India proper. The consequences would have been catastrophic, not just militarily but politically. An Indian uprising against British rule, which the Japanese were hoping to trigger, might well have succeeded if the British had suffered such a defeat. But perhaps most importantly, Kohima came to symbolize the transformation of the 14th Army under Slim's leadership. This was the same army that had been routed in 1942, that had fled Burma in the longest retreat in British history. In 2 years, Slim had rebuilt it, retrained it, and restored its morale. At Kohima and Imphal, the 14th Army proved that it could not only stand against the Japanese, but defeat them decisively. It was a story of redemption, of an army that had learned from its mistakes and come back stronger. For Japan, Kohima and Imphal represented the largest defeat the Imperial Japanese Army had suffered up to that point in the war. The losses in men, equipment, and prestige were catastrophic. The defeat shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility that had been carefully cultivated since the victories of 1942. It exposed fundamental flaws in Japanese military planning, particularly in logistics and command relationships, and it demonstrated that when the Allies had proper leadership, training, and resources, they could beat the Japanese even in jungle warfare. Interestingly, Japan also remembers Kohima, though in a different way. Japanese veterans who survived the battle and the horrendous retreat afterward carried memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Some returned to Kohima in later years, making pilgrimages to the battlefield, searching for the remains of comrades, trying to make sense of what they had been through. These veterans were often welcomed by the Naga people with a grace and forgiveness that spoke to the fundamental humanity that can transcend even the brutality of war. For India, the battle's significance was complex. On one hand, it represented the crucial role played by Indian soldiers in defending their own country against Japanese invasion. The Indian army units that fought at Kohima and Imphal, units like the Rajputs, the Punjabis, and the Assam Regiment, distinguished themselves with courage and professionalism. They fought not as colonial subjects, but as men defending their homeland, and they fought magnificently. On the other hand, the battle was also part of the colonial struggle. Some Indians, including members of the Indian National Army fighting alongside the Japanese, saw Operation You Go as a potential path to independence from British rule.
The defeat of the Japanese also meant the continuation of British control, at least for a few more years. This complexity means that Indian narratives of the battle have sometimes been conflicted, torn between pride in Indian military achievement and discomfort with the colonial context. For the Naga people specifically, the battle has gradually taken on greater recognition as central to their history and identity. For decades after the war, Naga contributions were largely forgotten in mainstream histories, but in recent years there has been a concerted effort to acknowledge and honor what the Nagas did during the battle. The Kohima Educational Trust, established by British veterans, provides scholarships to Naga children. Books like Mamhon Lumo Kikon's His Majesty's Headhunters tell the story from the Naga perspective, and annual Remembrance Day ceremonies at the Kohima War Cemetery bring together representatives from all the nations whose soldiers fought there, including Naga representatives honoring their own people's contribution. The battle also had profound effects on Naga political consciousness. The exposure to the modern world, to ideas about nationalism and self-determination, to the sight of the British Empire being challenged and
ultimately prevailing, all contributed to the emergence of movements for Naga autonomy. Some historians argue that the Battle of Kohima was a catalyzing event in Naga nationalism, helping to transform the Nagas' understanding of themselves from disparate tribes to a distinct people with shared interests and a political future to shape. Today, Kohima itself is a growing city, the capital of the state of Nagaland. The battlefield has been largely consumed by urban development. The tennis court area is now part of the carefully maintained cemetery. Garrison Hill is surrounded by buildings. The sites where men fought and died are now home to markets, schools, and offices. But the memory of the battle remains strong. Street names recall the fighting. Monuments and memorials dot the cityscape. And every year on Remembrance Day, ceremonies at the war cemetery bring together veterans, diplomats, soldiers, and ordinary citizens to honor those who fought there. The lessons of Kohima continue to resonate in military education. The battle is studied in staff colleges around the world as an example of successful defense against overwhelming odds, of the importance of logistics in military planning, of the consequences of poor command relationships, and of the crucial role that morale and leadership play in military effectiveness. Slim's generalship in particular is held up as a model of how to rebuild a defeated army and lead it to victory. But beyond the military lessons, Kohima teaches us something about the human experience of war. It shows us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to do your duty despite being terrified. It shows us that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, can achieve things that seem impossible. It shows us the cost of war, not just in lives lost, but in the physical and psychological wounds that survivors carry forever. The veterans of Kohima, British, Indian, Nepalese, African, Naga, and yes, Japanese too, all carried scars from the battle. Some were physical, missing limbs, blindness, scars from wounds that never fully healed. Others were psychological, nightmares, survivor's guilt, an inability to adjust to peacetime life after the intensity of combat. Many veterans struggled for years with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though in the 1940s it was simply called shell shock or battle fatigue, and there was little understanding or treatment available. Yet many of these same veterans also spoke of the battle as the defining experience of their lives, the moment when they were tested and found not wanting. They spoke of the bonds formed with their comrades, bonds that lasted a lifetime. They spoke of the satisfaction of having done something important, of having stood when it mattered, of having been part of something larger than themselves. And they spoke, almost without exception, of the need to remember, not to glorify war, not to make it seem romantic or noble, but to ensure that the sacrifices made were not forgotten, that the lessons learned were not lost.
This is why the epitaph at Kohima is so powerful. It's not triumphalist. It doesn't claim moral superiority or eternal glory. It simply asks that we remember that when we go home to our tomorrows, we tell of those who gave theirs. As the years pass and the last veterans of Kohima pass away, this duty of remembrance falls to subsequent generations. It falls to historians to record what happened accurately and completely. It falls to educators to teach about the battle in its full complexity. It falls to all of us to visit the cemeteries, to read the names on the headstones, to try to understand what those men experienced and what their sacrifice means. The Battle of Kohima was one battle in one campaign in one theatre of the Second World War. In the grand sweep of that global conflict, it might seem like a relatively small event, a sideshow to the main theatres in Europe and the Pacific. But to dismiss it as such would be to miss something profound. Kohima mattered, not just strategically, but morally. It was a test, and all involved on both sides were pushed to their absolute limits. Some passed that test with honor, men like John Harman and John Randle, who gave their lives to save their comrades, men like Colonel Hugh Richards, who commanded with skill and determination under impossible circumstances, men like General Sato, who valued the lives of his soldiers above obedience to insane orders, men like the Naga scouts and porters who risked everything to help an army that was not their own defend land that was theirs. Others failed the test. Mutaguchi's stubborn refusal to acknowledge reality cost tens of thousands of lives. The Japanese High Command's willingness to let men starve rather than admit their plans were flawed was a failure of leadership on a massive scale. The tendency of both sides to treat civilians as expendable in pursuit of military objectives was a moral failing that, while common in war, remains inexcusable. But in the end, what we remember most about Kohima is not the failures, but the triumphs of the human spirit. We remember men who faced unimaginable horrors and found within themselves the courage to continue. We remember soldiers who went days without sleep, who fought on empty stomachs, who stood in their foxholes hour after hour under shell fire because the alternative was to let down their mates. We remember medics who worked until they collapsed trying to save lives. We remember porters who carried wounded men through enemy fire without thought for their own safety. These are the people the epitaph honors. These are the people who gave their today for our tomorrow. And as long as we remember them, as long as we tell their stories, as long as we stand in the Kohima War Cemetery and read the names on the headstones, they are not forgotten. The Battle of Kohima was hell. It was brutal, savage, and terrifying. But it was also a moment when ordinary people did extraordinary things. It was a moment when a few thousand defenders held a ridge against all odds. It was a moment when the tide of war turned. It was a moment that mattered. And that's why we remember Kohima. Not because war is glorious, but because what these men did, what they endured, what they sacrificed, deserves to be remembered. For your tomorrow, they gave their today, and we should never forget.